Hello, everyone. My name is Siobhan, and I'm one of the naturalists at Earthplace. So thank you all for joining us tonight, as well as Jillian Cowles. Uh, if you're not familiar with Jillian, she wears many hats, including that of writer, photographer, clinical microbiologist, as well as naturalist. And tonight we are going to focus on the world of plant and insect interactions, and she's going to tell us about partnerships and betrayals, all between plant and insects. And so, before I let her take over fully, I'll give a few quick plugs for Earthplace itself. We have a lot of upcoming events in June and a little later in the summer as well. And some exciting ones that I'll plug are our Bio Blitz on June 8th, which is a Sunday. We're really excited to invite some local experts and help us survey all of the property at Earthplace for all sorts of animals, plants, fungi, uh, very cool things that are growing and living out there. And members of the public are welcome to join. We have a whole schedule for the day, so if you're interested in mushrooms, you can come when the mushroom expert will be there looking for mushrooms. Or if you're focused on birds, you can come when the bird expert will be there early in the morning. And then later in June, we have an event called Mothball, which will be on a Saturday this year on June 21st. And that is a big celebration of all sorts of nocturnal life, including moths, but also bats, owls, everyone else who might be out at night. It'll be light sheeting for moths. We'll be making it into a party, a big celebration. And if you're looking for the next environmental learning series lecture, like this event tonight, the next one will be a little after the summer. We'll take a little break for the summer months. And then in September, we'll come back and we'll learn about deer ecology and the relationship between deer and ticks and forest health. Um, so, having said all that, thank you for bearing with me. And then Jillian Cowles, I'll let you take over and tell us about plant and insect interactions.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to be zipping through this talk because there's a lot of material to cover. So let's dig in. First of all, insect-plant interactions can consist of herbivory and defenses against herbivory, pollination, including the co-evolution of plants and pollinators, and special relationships that tend to be ant-plant relationships. So among the herbivory, you can have chewing type herbivores that would include grasshoppers, walking sticks, beetles, caterpillars, and also root borers and wood borers. And then you can also have piercing sucking insects that include true bugs, cicadas, leafhoppers, plant hoppers, scales, and aphids. And then some specialized herbivory that would be galls that includes gall midges and gall wasps, and then minors that include beetles, moths, sawflies, and also regular diptera, which are regular flies. Among the plant defenses, you have direct defenses that can include chemical defenses and hypersensitivity reactions, and indirect defenses, which deploy predators, parasitoids, and a community response. So that's a lot to take in, so let's get going. Okay, so among the classic herbivores would be grasshoppers. All the insects I'm going to be showing in this talk were photographed in Arizona, which has some of the most spectacular insects in the country. It draws a lot of people for the insects as well as the birds, and you can see why, like in the grasshopper, that's the real colors. A toothpick grasshopper and a panther grasshopper. Then you have your nighttime herbivores, such as this tree cricket. And by the way, these tree crickets sing at night, and there's the specialized parasitoid fly that actually is active at night and seeks them out using sound. There's walking sticks, such as this long-horned walking stick, which tends to be found in shrubs, and then short-horned walking sticks that are found in grasses. Chrysomylid beetles are probably some of the most exquisitely adapted beetles in terms of working around plant toxins. These beetles have evolved kinds of mechanisms for either metabolizing or sequestering the toxins that plants produce in the plant's arms race against herbivory. So here's a chrysomyelid beetle larva on a convolvulucid leaf. And the adult one is this tortoise beetle. Caterpillars are basically eating machines. Their whole purpose in life until they reach pupation is to eat and grow and eat and grow and molt. So these white-lined sphinx moth caterpillars are generalists that can eat a wide variety of host plants, but some caterpillars are extremely specialized. And this particular species not only must find a desert broom plant to lay her eggs on. This is a desert broom flower here, and it's in the Asteraceae family. But desert brooms come in, the individual plants are in either a male plant or a female plant. This moth has to lay its eggs on a plant that's very close in proximity to a plant of the opposite sex, because the caterpillar, in order to complete their development, must feed from both male and female desert broom plants. And then you have some specialized kinds of herbivory, or not even technically herbivory all the time. These Synchlora moths, their caterpillars not only feed on plants, but they'll snip off little pieces of plant and tie them onto their back with silk. And that's their way of being more camouflaged. So in this case, it's feeding on a Bahia absinthifolia flower, and it was snipping off little florets and tying them on its back with silk. But sometimes you'll see little pieces of leaves or other objects tied on their backs. And let's not forget the wood borers. So a lot of the what you call jewel beetles are wood borer beetles. And the root borer beetles also are herbivores. So the larvae of these Palo Verde root borer beetles naturally feed on the roots of Palo Verde trees. Among the sucking, piercing insects, there are some that are well adapted to plant toxins as well, such as this milkweed bug. This is on a milkweed pod. And the giant mesquite bug tends to get a lot of people's attention. These bugs are huge and they go flying around and people get really excited. Their nymphs are brightly colored though. This is a very young nymph, but as they get older, they get even more conspicuous and they tend to aggregate. And they produce little very odorous chemical substances in these pores on the dorsal surface of the nymphs. And so very few predators will feed on these giant mesquite bugs, but a few predators will feed on them, including pallid bats that will actually land on mesquite trees and walk along the branches of the trees and catch those giant mesquite nymphs and then feed on them. Of course, cicadas are well known as piercing, sucking insects that feed underground on the roots of plants until they emerge and you see them bombing around. This is called a cactus dodger cicada. And then leaf hoppers of all kinds are piercing, sucking insects. And they come in many beautiful colors. These Arizona leaf hoppers are just stunningly beautiful. I think purple is just totally unexpected in an insect. And they come in all sizes, and even the nymphs like this one are quite beautiful. And some of the plant hoppers develop structures that look a lot like thorns as a means of defense, so that a potential predator will look at the branch and think it's just a thorn instead of a tasty insect. As you can see, this plant hopper has a long thorn-like projection coming up from its head. Some of the nymphs are very fanciful looking of the plant hoppers. This is an oak plant hopper, very beautiful. And this one is found on a cat claw acacia, and it has what looks like a couple thorns coming out of its head. Some of the plant hoppers are interesting in that, for the most part, piercing sucking herbivores are taking in far more carbohydrate than protein. So the limiting nutrient is protein, and they have to take in vast amounts of carbohydrate for every necessary bit of protein that they're getting. And as a consequence, the carbohydrate is frequently excreted as waste. So aphids excrete it as honeydew, but in some of the plant hoppers, like the succeed nymph that feeds on tree roots, it would gum up the surface of its substrate very quickly if it was excreting honeydew constantly. So instead, it converts those carbohydrates into these waxy filaments out of the rear part of its body. And those waxy filaments are great as a defense because a predator might go for those instead of the body of the succeed nymph. And it can drop those filaments with no harm to the nymph. Even some of the tree hopping type plant hoppers produce these waxy filaments. For example, the nymph of this kind of insect looks like this, and it has these pink waxy filaments coming out of its tail. These live on live oak trees. And when it feels threatened, it raises these waxy filaments and spreads them out so that they become more conspicuous. And hopefully the predator will go for that rather than the actual nymph. Now, scales are kind of interesting. On this particular legume that we have in southern Arizona, if you look at the stems, you'll see this sort of gummy accumulation on the exterior of the stem, and those little red dots, if you look a little more closely, those are scale insects. So the scale insects can exude this resiny-like substance, which is probably, once again, carbohydrate that's being processed and excreted as excess, which can protect the scale insects under all that coating. But that's gathered and made into lacquer. So lac in one of the Indian languages means 100,000. And so it takes a lot of these little insects to produce lacquer when they collect that from these stems. Galls are a special form of herbivory where the gall is formed after the insect has reprogrammed the plant to build a specialized structure that serves as a nursery and food for the insect's offspring. So gall midges, like these Sachydomeid flies, are one of the groups that form galls. And the galls produced by these little flies can be fuzzy, like these ones found on saltbush, or they can look like this on creosote bush from a different species of gall midge. But the true masters of galls are the cynipid wasps. So these cynipid wasps are only about 3 millimeters long. They don't look particularly exciting, but there's many, many species of cynipid wasps, and they produce many, many galls. So they can be these ball-shaped galls. These are all on live oak that I'm going to be showing you. Or these fuzzy type galls, or urn-shaped galls. That's a close-up of that little urn-shaped gall, or even spindle-shaped galls. Now, one of the defenses that plants can mount is a hypersensitivity reaction. So if the plant detects a gall being formed on it, it can actually wall off that area on that leaf and starve out the gall. So that's one of the direct defenses that plants can deploy if they detect a gall. Leaf miners are a specialized kind of herbivore, and this is a chrysmelid beetle that's sitting on top of a leaf, and you can see all the mines underneath that beetle, and those were formed by the larva of the beetle. They feed within the tissues of the leaf, as do these little weevils that are leaf miners. And some of the really specialized leaf miners are moths, microlep moths. So this particular moth was only about 3 millimeters long. It emerged from this live oak leaf, and you can see that where it had been feeding within the tissues of this leaf. But sometimes what emerges from that will be a little parasitoid wasp. So the parasitoid wasps can detect some of those little lepidopteran larvae that are feeding within the tissue, and actually they can lay their eggs on that little host, and that little caterpillar will instead produce a wasp instead of a nice little moth. Of course, the masters of getting around plant defenses are the chrysomelid beetles. And here's a chrysomelid beetle that had been feeding on a datura leaf. And daturas produce a lot of alkaloids. Their leaves are toxic for most herbivores, but this beetle has clearly learned how to, well, learned, I use in quotation marks, has evolved mechanisms for dealing with these alkaloids, and it can feed readily on that leaf. So what plants can do is deploy a second line of defense, which is indirect defenses. And that means calling in the predators and parasitoids to those herbivores. For example, if a caterpillar is chewing on a leaf, the plant actually can identify what type of caterpillar it is that is feeding on the leaf from its saliva. The plant is being exposed to the molecular signature of that caterpillar through the caterpillar's saliva. And in response, the plant will produce volatile chemicals that will call in specific predators and parasitoids for that herbivore, in the case of the caterpillar. Well, in this case, I had a cilantro plant that was in my greenhouse that became infested with aphids. And so I put the plant outside where the volatile chemicals that were being released could get out to various predators and parasitoids. And within hours, along came these syrphid flies. And these syrphid flies produced eggs. You can see one actually in the process of laying an egg right there between those two little aphids. You can see that white object, that's a syrphid fly egg. And these syrphid flies hatch into maggots, which proceed to slurp down aphids as if they were marshmallows. So here's a syrphid fly larva eating an aphid, and here's another one eating an aphid. Some other parasitoids that are called in, of course, the syrphid flies are predators. The parasitoids that were called in by that cilantro plant included these braconid wasps. These braconid wasps, when they encounter an aphid, they'll oviposit into the aphid. Then they clean off their little ovipositors. And later on, that aphid will develop a wasp larva growing inside it. You can actually see this wasp through this cleared body of this aphid. So eventually the aphids sort of mummify as those wasps are doing pupation and maturing. These little mummies, these are aphid mummies that have wasp larvae pupating inside. And when the larvae are ready to emerge, they cut these neat little round hatches and emerge as adult wasps. Okay, and one other defense that I thought I'd mention before we move on to pollinators and the coevolution of plants is that plants can also deploy a community response. These volatile chemicals that call in predators and parasitoids, neighboring plants can eavesdrop on those volatile chemicals, and it will induce those plants to start ramping up their own production of tannins and alkaloids or whatever other chemical defenses those plants have. Once that entire patch of plants becomes less attractive to herbivores, it protects all of them. So that sort of community response is another part of plant defenses. Okay, now let's talk about plants and pollinators. So plants evolve nectar, pollen, flower form, and blooming time in response to pollinators, and pollinators evolve structures such as tongues, eyesight, etc., and behaviors, including flower handling, hovering, fidelity, etc., in response to flowers. The plants and their pollinators have co-evolved, contributing to the explosion of angiosperm diversity. So among pollinators are bats, birds such as doves and hummingbirds, and insects such as beetles, flies, butterflies, moths, wasps, and bees. So a plant like an agave is bat pollinated principally, and it has a tall stalk waving way up in the air. These flowers don't really have a landing platform. So nectar feeding bats are the primary pollinators of these plants. Saguaro flowers are another good example of a bat pollinated flower. These produce copious amounts of very dilute pollen, very dilute nectar that is really not beneficial to native bees. Honeybees can concentrate down that nectar into something that they can use, but native bees really can't. So these are pollinated primarily by bats and also by birds like doves. The erythrina flowers are primarily pollinated by hummingbirds. These long red tubular flowers have no landing platform, and neither do these penstemon eatoni. And a close-up of the penstemon eatoni, you can see there's no landing platform. They're really evolved, co-evolved with a hovering pollinator that homes in on red flowers, which would be hummingbirds. In contrast, look at this penstemon discolor. It has a landing platform for insects. It has nectar guides in the form of these little stripes leading down in the throat. And it even has these fake anthers on the lip of the flower. You can see these little fake anthers. The real anthers are up top here, but the fake ones are evolved to draw in insect pollinators. And some flowers are highly complex and require a lot of specialized learning for the pollinator to get the nectar reward and succeed in pollinating that flower. So examples of very specialized flower structures would be delphiniums and also monkswoods that are in the same family, the Ranunculaceae or buttercup family. Another kind of specialized flower are the keel-shaped flowers that some of the Fabaceae or pea family produce. And these are keeled-shaped flowers. You can see the little keels here. And it requires a specialized pollinator to open up that flower and get access to those anthers. So among the best pollinators are nomia bees. Honeybees are really terrible pollinators of these keel-type flowers. So the honeybees are not very successful at pollinating plants like alfalfa and clover that have those keel-shaped flowers. However, these nomia bees, as you can see, readily can handle them. This is a wild bean, a phaseolus, and here's a nomia bee that is clearly accessing the pollen from the flower. Other specialized pollen structures are found in the Solanaceae family, which includes things like tomatoes, potatoes, deadly nightshade, and here's a silverleaf nightshade, and you can see that these Solanaceae family plants have their pollen contained in a little pouch-like anther with a pore at the tip. And what pollinators have to do for this type of flower is that they grasp the base of the anther in their mandible and then vibrate their wing muscles rather. And once that pollen starts vibrating very rapidly within that little pouch, all of a sudden explodes out through the pore of the anther. This is called buzz pollination. And if you want to test this and see it for yourself, if you ever grow tomatoes, you can take an electric toothbrush and take the toothbrush off the end and just use the electric little end of the handle part and put it at the base of the anther, and within less than a second, you'll see pollen bursting out of the end of the pore. Other plants that require buzz pollination are in the Ericaceae family, which includes blueberries and cranberries. So those crops have to be pollinated by insects that can do the buzz pollination. And tomatoes are primarily pollinated by bumblebees in commercial tomato houses. Honeybees, once again, do not do the buzz pollination, so they're not very successful at pollinating those particular crops. This is manzanita flower, and here's another manzanita being pollinated by an osmia bee, which is known also as an orchard bee. And these bees reach in there into the flower and vibrate those anthers and get the pollen that way. Another trick that plants have in order to be pollinated is that some of them will signal to the pollinators which flowers have already been pollinated and which have not been pollinated. You can see that these Palo Verde flowers have banner petals of different colors. Some of the banner petals are a deep orange and others are a yellow. The flowers that have already been pollinated indicate that they've already been pollinated by the banner petal turning that deep orange color. The ones that have yet to be pollinated are the yellow. So therefore, the plant can more efficiently help the pollinator pollinate the flowers that still require it. So here you can see on this lupin that some of these banner petals are a deep maroon color and others are white. All these flowers opened at the same time. So it's not the age of the flower that determines that color. It's whether or not the flower had been pollinated. And you can actually see that on these deep maroon ones, some of them, the anthers are exposed from that keel-shaped flower, whereas these other ones, you can't see the anthers on the ones with the white banner petals. That's because those anthers have not been exposed yet by the pollinator. Now, there's a difference between visitation and pollination, and this white-lined sphinx moth is visiting a thistle, but not performing pollination duties. However, a moth like that might easily be able to pollinate this Mirabilis longiflora because its long tongue could reach the nectar reward, and in the meantime, its head would be hopefully bumping these anthers. So this long corolla has nectar at the very bottom, and this is a very nice example of coevolution of the pollinator and the plant. In fact, Charles Darwin predicted that there was a moth on Madagascar with a tongue 13 inches long after he saw the orchid Angræacum sesquipedale that had a long spur that was 13 inches long. And sure enough, years later, the moth was discovered with a 13-inch long tongue. So these plants evolve. It's kind of like an arms race to make sure that the pollinator has to bump that pollen before they can get the nectar reward. Now, some more generalized pollinators go for more simple exposed flowers. So those tend to be disc flowers and some of the other flowers. And those generalist pollinators tend to be things like beetles and flies. There's one exception to that, which is a special fly that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So some of the beetles, as an example, this is on a hibiscus, desert hibiscus plant, and you can see the little grains of pollen on its feet. So these beetles can be reasonably good pollinators of some of these flowers that have more easily accessible anthers. And here's a few more examples. This is a little agrolexia visiting a bouvardia flower. Bouvardia is in the coffee family. And this trichodes beetle, you can see how the fuzzy little beetle, just moving around in that flower, it gets covered with pollen. Some other beetles that you might see on flowers are soldier beetles and longhorn beetles and scarab beetles. And among the flies that you might see are things like bee flies, which show convergent evolution with hummingbirds in the sense that they can hover and they have a very long nectar feeding structure for reaching into the corolla of the flower. This is another little bombyliid. And the syrphid flies are also known as hover flies. And these can hover very nicely. This one's approaching a valerian flower. And you can see that a lot of these flies in the syrphid family show Batesian mimicry, whereby they mimic a hornet or other stinging hymenoptera. So even though these flies are harmless and couldn't sting you, they look dangerous and predators presumably avoid them. This other syrphid fly is a mimic of a honeybee. And this syrphid fly mimics a hornet. Now, a specialized kind of pollination has evolved with this flower called Aristolochia watsoni, also known as a pipe vine. So the flower of the pipe vine is a peculiar structure. The business end, where the male and female flower parts are way down in this little pouch at the bottom of the flower. But the top of the flower looks something like a rabbit ear, and it has these little downward pointing hairs. And the theory is that the pollinator on this is a little biting fly, which is attracted to this structure, and it thinks it's going to get a blood meal. And instead, the little hairs direct it down into the pouch, and those little hairs don't let it escape. And it stumbles around in the bottom of the pouch, and hopefully it's carrying pollen from a previously visited Aristolochia flower. If it pollinates the female flowers inside this pouch, then the male flowers mature and release anther, and that little fly, as it stumbles around down in that pouch, will hopefully become covered with pollen. At that point, the hairs have withered on this, and they allow the little fly to escape. And hopefully it'll go visit another Aristolochia flower. The Aristolochia is very toxic to most insects. So the only herbivore that's really known to feed on this is this pipevine swallowtail butterfly. And these munch away on these very toxic leaves very happily. And eventually you get the beautiful butterfly. So without the nasty little biting flies, you wouldn't get these beautiful butterflies, because the Aristolochia watsoni depends on those little biting flies for pollination. Other butterflies, of course, are known to be pollinators, such as our beautiful swallowtails. And some of our sphinx moths are also pollinators, such as this nice clear-winged sphinx moth that has pollen all over its little face as it's visiting these wild honeysuckle plants. Now, one specialized sort of pollination occurs with yuccas. So yucca flowers are white. They attract a night pollinator. So if you were to examine a yucca flower at night, you might be lucky enough to see this little white moth inside the flower. And these moths are specialized pollinators. Each species of yucca has its own species of yucca moth. And the yucca moths actually deliberately pollinate the yucca flower. Most pollination by insects is incidental, while the insect is trying to get either a nectar or pollen reward. But in the case of these yucca moths, they actually have specialized little structures that they carry the yucca pollen, and they place it on the tip of the stigma of the yucca so that they pollinate that flower. And they lay their eggs in the ovary of the fruit of the developing yucca. So if the moth lays too many eggs in there, the yucca will abort that fruit and drop it on the ground. And so if a moth is too greedy and produces too many caterpillars that will eat all the yucca seeds, then the yucca will abort those, and those particular larvae won't mature. The yucca moth and the yucca absolutely require each other. This is called obligate mutualism because the moth, that's the only food source for its larva. And for the yucca, that's the only pollinator that can perform the duties of pollination for it. Now, Hymenoptera are very famous for being pollinators, and the wasps are, in fact, pretty good at it. This is a paper wasp that is tanking up on nectar in the fall. It'll store fat in its body and then be one of the founding ones to start a new colony in the following spring. And some of the wasps are very beautiful, like these little Chrysitidae wasps. They look like little jewels. And some wasps, like these sawflies, play two roles with plants. In this case, the sawfly is probably assisting in pollination of these wild heliotrophs. But in other cases, the sawflies are herbivores, and they look almost like caterpillars in many respects. Sawfly larvae do, and they tend to be herbivorous. Some wasps are maybe specialized for certain flowers. This is a Huachuca water umbel, which is an endangered species of plant. That flower is only 3 millimeters across, and that tiny little wasp is only a little over 1 millimeter long. And I saw numbers of these little wasps visiting Huachuca water umbel flowers, and these might be the pollinators for that particular flower. Nobody knows for sure. And some wasps are very specialized. The pollen wasps have dropped the business of being carnivores. Most wasps feed on other insects, but pollen wasps actually gather pollen, very similar to what a bee does. They have these club-shaped antennae, so you can always tell that they're pollen wasps. And they build these little mud nests and provision these mud nests with pollen for their larvae. So that shows convergent evolution with honeybees in terms of transferring to pollen as the primary source of protein for their larvae rather than feeding on insects. And this honeybees, of course, are one of the best pollinators, partly because they have great fidelity to a particular species of plant. Any one day, that bee will visit primarily that species of plant and will continue to do so. So they transfer pollen between individuals within a species of plant and are very good at cross-pollinating. Some of them are generalists, like this centrist bee that visits creosote as well as cremaria as well as paloverdi. This is another generalist, which is a little sweat bee. And another sweat bee. But some of them are specialists, like this Trichusa lariae, which visits only creosote flowers. This is another specialist. This only visits bladder pod plants in the Physaria gordonii and Physaria purpura. And these are one of the earliest spring bees, so they're Andrena prima. This one is the centrist bee, primarily visits paloverdes and ironwood trees, both in the Fabaceae family. So some specialists are sort of in between a specialist and a generalist, where they might visit plants within a family rather within a species. This Peponathus is a squash bee, so these ones visit cucurbits. And this little Perdita minima is a specialist on euphorbias. Specifically, Euphorbia pediculifera is where you primarily find these little Perdita minima, which is allegedly the smallest bee in the world. Megachyle bees, leafcutter bees, have a dual role. They not only collect pollen and you can on specialized hairs under their abdomen, but they cut leaves, which they line the chambers of their brood cells with these leaves, and they also use the leaves to separate the different cells within the brood chamber. So these nest in tubular holes in wood, like abandoned wood borer beetle holes. And some people can even put up little bee hotels with a lot of these little holes in the wood for these leaf cutter bees. So they'll cut the leaves and then sort of adjust their hold as they're dropping down from the leaf. And then they fly off to use that as a liner for their brood chambers. So they use plants in two different ways. One is for provisions for their larvae, as well as nectar for energy for the adult bee. And then in addition to that, they use these pieces of leaves to line their brood chambers. Some of them use petals instead of leaves. So this particular species was cutting a mallow flower. Diadasia bees are specialized on cactus flowers. They are solitary in the sense that each one digs its own burrow and builds a little chimney above the burrow. But they tend to nest in aggregations so that it looks like a little village of these bees. And they specialize in going after opuntia flowers, which means flowers that are in the cholla or prickly pear group. So you'll notice that these two flowers are different. One of them has anthers that are spread out a little bit, and one has anthers tight into the center. So if a bee hasn't visited a cactus flower for a long time, these anthers are all spread out. But if you were to run your finger around the anthers in real time, you'll see them scrunch down to the center. So as a bee is visiting a cactus flower, here's one that's just in the process of visiting, and you can see that those anthers are still a little spread out. And by the time it's finished, they're all scrunched into the middle. Basically, what those anthers do is that they embrace the bee. And the bee is fuzzy. It has a lot of hairs on it. And that way, the flower can better coat the bee with the pollen. And so this is a wonderful adaptation on the part of the plant with these moving anthers that are able to embrace the pollinator and coat that pollinator with pollen. The Diadasia bee nests are in the ground, and they attract various other insects. For example, these little velvet wasps lay their eggs in the Diadasia nest, and their larvae usurp those nests, as do these bombyliid flies that flick their eggs into the burrow of the Diadasia. So they'll actually hover over the little ground nest of the bee, and they'll flick an egg in there, and their larvae will go in and eat all the contents and usurp that nest. And if you look on the leg of this Diadasia bee, there's a strange little reddish structure. And if you look closer, there it is. That's the larva of a blister beetle. It's at a stage, it's called a triangulin, and it'll grab hold of a bee leg, the hairs on the bee leg, hitch a ride to the bee nest, and it'll usurp that nest. And in the spring, what you see emerging is an adult blister beetle. This is an iron cross blister beetle. Now let's go over the difference between visitation and pollination. So here's a coral root orchid. These are mycorrhizal parasites. And the pollen on coral root orchids, like all orchids, is contained in a little pollinia. So they don't have anthers like other flowers. They have these specialized little packets of pollen called pollinia. And a pollinator has to pick up those little pollinia, usually on the dorsal surface of its thorax. So I stared for hours at these spring coral root orchids, trying to see who was pollinating them. These little halictid bees were going in and out, but there was no pollinia on the dorsal surface of the thorax. But when I was photographing these little tiny syrphid flies, I noticed some odd maroon blobs on the top of the fly. And in side view, you can see these are orchid pollinia from those spring coral root orchids. There's nothing else that looks like that. So possibly these little syrphid flies might be the pollinators of those spring coral root orchids. A proper pollinator goes in through the front door, but a thief will rob the nectar by cutting a little slit at the base of the flower and suck out the nectar without performing pollination duties. And that's what this carpenter bee is doing. But flowers cheat as well. So here's a commelina flower. It has 3 kinds of anthers. These bright yellow ones are totally fake. They don't have any pollen. There's a big yellow anther here that has low quality fodder pollen. And the really business end pollen is down here. So the plant lures in pollinators to here using these bright yellow fake anthers. The pollinator hopefully will take some of this fodder pollen and then hopefully will bump against the real anthers, the ones with the good quality pollen. Calypso orchids have carried this to an extreme. These have fake anthers on their lip. They lure in bees that are naive, and there's absolutely no reward. So after only a few visits, the bees learn that there's no reward and they stop visiting the orchid. So this is a strategy of diminishing returns over time. Let's cover plant and ant-plant relationships very quickly. Ants do protection against herbivores, and they protect herbivores. They do fungus farming, aeration and enhancement of soil, and dispersal of seeds. So one of the chief ways that plants lure in ants as protection is through extrafloral nectaries. So this is a barrel cactus with a bud on it. Here's the flower bud, and here's the extrafloral nectaries, which are bribing these ants to hang around. And hopefully these ants will attack any herbivore that would otherwise chew up these flowers. So the problem with ants is that they're kind of like the mafia. If they get paid off, they'll protect whoever pays them the most. So in the case of aphids, as I mentioned, are excreting excess carbohydrate in the form of honeydew. And ants will actively defend those aphids for that nectar reward. Here you can see an ant sucking down a drop of honeydew. And remember, under the soil surface, similar scenarios take place. In this case, these laziest ants are tending to root aphids, which they get rewards from, and they transport these aphids around onto roots of plants. The canid butterflies have a very specialized relationship with ants. Their caterpillars reward ants with a little sugary treat in exchange for defense of the caterpillar larva. And allegedly, the caterpillar can even squeak if it's in distress and call in help from the ant. Fungus farming is another way that ants interact with plants. Here's a newly mated queen of an acromyrmex ant. This is a leaf cut that has just mated, and she's going to have to start her own colony. So she has to dig a burrow. In the very night that she mates, she has to dig her burrow. So the next morning, she's carrying out these little pebbles as she's digging her burrow. This one has shed her wings. Usually after they mate, they shed their wings. This one's carrying out a lump of mud. They do this burrow right after rain when the earth is soft. So the first thing that the queen has to do is lay trophic eggs, and then she plants a starter culture of fungus that she's been carrying in a buccal pouch. She has a special little pocket in her mouth for where she can transport a little starter colony of the fungus that she's going to farm. So once she has her little burrow dug, she lays some trophic eggs. She plants the fungus on those eggs, and she waters them by defecating on them. Once the fungus is grown, she can feed that fungus to her daughter ants. She'll lay more eggs that are fertile that have daughter ants. She feeds the fungus to those ants. Once those ants are mature, they go out and cut these leaves or flowers, and they carry them to the burrow entrance. They let them dry out a little bit, and then they carry them down and they chew them up into paper mache, and they plant the fungus on those paper mache. They tend to the fungus, they feed on that, they lay trophic eggs, which they feed to the queen ant, and the queen ant produces more eggs that produces more ants. So here you can see these flowers, these ocotillo flowers being dried around the entranceway. Fungus farming has been going on for at least 6 million years, which makes our domestication of crops seem pretty recent. And many of these fungus species are so closely associated with fungus farming ants that they are no longer found out in the wild away from the ant colonies. Basically, the ants and the fungi have a symbiotic relationship. Harvester ants gather seeds and they carry them below the ground. So they aerate the ground and they incorporate organic matter underground where it doesn't get just burnt off by oxidation. And there's a whole nother trophic level to harvester ants because the horned lizard feeds on the harvester ants, and there's a tapeworm that actually its life cycle goes between the horned lizard and the harvester ants. So these trophic levels are really interesting. And one of the things that comes out, for example, with the diadasia nest having velvet ants and bombyliid flies and blister beetles, and this horned lizard and harvester ants having tapeworm that cycles, is that diversity begets diversity. Every species seems to provide resources for yet another species. And let's look at datura flowers. So these are called angel trumpets, and they attract night blooming pollinators. And after they've been pollinated, they produce these spiny seeds. These seed pods open up to the ground. So this is the underside of a seed pod, and you can see the seeds looking down up. These would be facing downwards and would fall out onto the ground. But there's this peculiar little white cushion between the seed and the maternal tissue here. There's this weird little white cushion on each seed of this datura discolor. This is a close-up of those seeds with their little cushions. And these little cushions can readily disassociate from the seed. And what these are is special little food bodies that ants go bonkers for. So these Ephenegaster ants, when they encountered these datura seeds, they immediately grabbed them and carried them into their nest. In the nest, they strip off that little food body and eat it, and then they carry the seed back out onto the discard waste pile of the nest. As a consequence, the seed is still viable. That little food body being stripped off does not affect the viability of the seed at all. But what that does is it removes the seed from under the plant where rodents would feed on that seed. And in cases where, in a study where they actually measured the seed loss to rodents, in 3 days' time, all the seeds were eaten underneath the plant, but the seeds on average lasted a whole month if they were on the discard pile of the Ephenegaster ants, because the rodents don't like going out in the open where the ant nest is. They don't feed on those seeds. So this has become a really good way for the plant to get dispersal of seeds and to protect the seeds from rodents eating them. So I want to finish the talk with one last quick thought. Charles Darwin, when he came up with his theory of natural selection, he was bothered by the explosion of angiosperm plants during the Cretaceous. There was just this huge burst of diversity of plants that occurred during the Cretaceous, and that kind of bothered him. He called it the abominable problem. And I think that the solution to that problem was the coevolution of plant insect diversity, that these plants, as they evolved alkaloids and other defenses, it pushed for insect diversity, both in herbivores, and then also the plant pollinator coevolution was a very exquisite case of coevolution. So it really, really turbocharged the business of um, a huge diversity of species evolving for each little niche. The resources that I used are plant insect biology. This book here, this book is an excellent one for reading, especially about herbivory. And this book, Pollination and Floral Ecology, I highly recommend this. The pollination details about pollination. You can dig as deep as you want with that book. The Leafcutter Ants is this little book that is loaded with so much interesting information. I highly, highly recommend all three of these books. And then if you want to dig into that business of the mutualism between the harvester ants and the daturas, you can look at this little article that was published back in 1980. Many other plants have also evolved this strategy of a little food reward attached to their seeds that rewards ants for dispersing those seeds. So that's the end of my talk. If there's any questions.
I've got a question.
Okay.
How long did it take you to actually take all those photos? Because you said all of those pictures are yours, right?
Yeah, I've been photographing things for about 20 years, and it started out with photographing wildflowers so that I could learn what species were growing in my immediate area of my yard and within easy walking distance. And then that expanded to southern Arizona, and now it's pretty much the Southwest as well. So, and then as I photographed plants, I noticed more and more arthropods on the plants. And so I started digging into that and branched off into arachnids. So I got very interested in arachnids and wrote a book about arachnids. And I still love photographing native bees. The native bees in southern Arizona number somewhere around 1,000 species. It's one of the 3 diversity hotspots for native bees in the entire world. So how could I not get excited about native bees? And so when you're photographing native flowers, of course, you're going to get tempted to try for some of those native bees, which are very difficult to photograph usually.
Right. How do you feel about iNaturalists and people, you said you started off because you wanted to know, what flowers were around you. How do you feel about, iNaturalists coming on the scene
I,
and people?
I think iNaturalist is one of the most powerful tools to make people feel vested in the planet. Because as soon as somebody posts a picture that they took for all the world to see, they feel a special connection with that organism, whether it's a plant or an insect or a bird or whatever. And I think it makes people care about their planet more and want to learn more about it. And it gives them a tool to learn more about it. So all around, it's a great, great tool.
That's
That said, you have to be careful. That said, I think that there are some caveats. Some of the areas for iNaturalists are better than others. Well, like I've heard that it's not that great for earthworm identifications, but it gets better and better over time. And so it has AI built in. So the more images and the better images it gets, the better it learns how to recognize that particular organism. So if you can get good images, I highly urge you to get them on iNaturalist, because that will help everybody learn, not only the AI of the program, but other people that want to learn about that organism. I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so true. It's an instant connection for people. There's no trying to learn the ID characteristics, which is fun in itself, but if you don't have time, then you can't get into it. It's a big barrier in the past. Siobhan on Earthplace asked, do you know why so many gall wasps and other insects use oaks as their host? Is there something particularly special about oaks?
Well, I think there's probably a few things. One of which is that oaks are long-lived and are there, you know, they're a tree, so they're around for a long time. So they're not going to be a little annual that's here and gone within a year. Many of these gall wasps actually require more than 1 year to mature. So they need something that's going to be around for a while. So oaks are around for a while, and there must be something about the oak that makes it pretty susceptible to having the gall insect reprogram that tissue. You know, maybe some of the other plants aren't that easy to do that with. I can't really think of too many other things that would be that jump to mind, but it's a very good question. There are tons and tons of oak gall species, so
Do you have
it's a real treasure. Do I have any favorites? Oh gosh. No, I think I like them all. All the ones I found so far. Yeah, they're all very interesting. And if you want to find out more about galls, and there's a guy named Louis Nastasi who was with, I think he just wrapped up his graduate student work at Penn State, I think it was Pennsylvania State University, maybe. He was giving a wasp identification course over the past few years, but he didn't do it this year because he was going to be defending his thesis this year. But he was working with galls a lot, and they were discovering some incredible stuff. Some of the gall wasps have really, really complicated life cycles with alternating generations, almost like aphids have alternating generations where one generation will be winged and one's not winged. And with gall wasps, there apparently are alternating generations for utilizing different host plants. So they might not be the straightforward, oh, one host plant is always the same thing for that species of gall wasps. They might have alternating generations for different host plants. So they can be very complicated.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree, Louis Nastasi is a great resource. Hopefully maybe we can have him on a talk for
Oh, I think you should. He's really, really I consider him like a national treasure, you know. He's really that good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. If we don't have any other questions, we can wrap it up and I'll stop the recording, or Siobhan can end the recording.
Thank you for having me.
Later, they can always email us and we'll connect to you. But thank you guys for joining, and thank you so much, Jillian, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope that folks will look at plants and insects in a new light after this talk, and will dig deeper themselves. Those books I recommended are really worth I read each of those books twice and took notes the second time I read each one. I filled up a notebook with each one, just taking notes, because there's so much material in there. So I barely scratched the surface. There's lots more to learn.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Jillian.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you guys.